next speaker that I'm going to introduce is Roger Thoreau. He's an expert and an author on agriculture. His book is The Last Hunger Season. I read it as I was traveling through Tanzania last year, and what struck me is this. I love data. Data really tells us whether programs are happening and where people are. It helps us in agriculture know whether we're moving things at a country and a system level and a global level to change things for people. But what Roger does so effectively in his book is bring it home to the farmers, the men and the women who we meet on the continent of Africa, who are eking out a living, often on a small plot of land. And he shares their stories, their incredible ingenuity about how they manage their farms, particularly in these seasons between crops, when they're trying to feed their children and they are struggling and desperately trying to make ends meet so they can keep their children in school. And then he takes those stories and connects them to the global systems level and the data to show us how change happens. And he's quite an amazing journalist and writer. Roger?
Ethiopia, the Berecha Plateau, May 2003. A biblical scholar would call it my road to Damascus moment. A scientist would say it was my eureka moment. A military strategist would likely say it was my crossing the Rubicon moment. But this moment, at our glorious and wonderful TED exchange, we shall call it my moment of great disruption. And appropriately so. I'd been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for more than 2 decades at the time. And for most of those years, I was a foreign correspondent. And I did what foreign correspondents do. I wandered from place to place, from story to story. I was always on the move, rarely going back to any place that I had been. Until one place, one story, stopped me cold. Ethiopia, 2003, the first famine of the 21st century. 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation, being kept alive, if they were to survive at all, by international food aid. My first day in Addis Ababa, a relief worker with the World Food Program was giving me a briefing on the extent of the famine and what we would be seeing in coming days. He gave me a piece of advice, but as I listened to him, it sounded like a fairly ominous warning to me. He said, looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger becomes a disease of the soul. You see that nobody should have to die of hunger. A disease of the soul. Wow, what was this guy talking about? I was used to receiving an overdose of medical advice. Protect yourself against malaria, watch out for cholera epidemics, mind the meningitis season. But a disease of the soul. The next day, we were down in the hunger zones in southern Ethiopia. We drove up a corkscrew road to the Berecha Plateau in the highlands. We made our way to a market center where we found a warren of large olive green emergency feeding tents that had been erected. Inside those tents were dozens upon dozens of starving children and their anguished parents. I parted the flaps of one of the tents and I stepped inside. There, for the first time, I looked into the eyes of the hungry, the starving. They were the eyes of Hargirso and Tesfaye Katema. 5-year-old Hargirso, he weighed just 27 pounds when his father Tesfaye had carried him into this tent just a few days earlier. Severely malnourished, his face is swollen, his belly is extended, and his legs were too thin and too weak to stand. Oftentimes his father had his legs spread around him to kind of prop him up. And his eyes, Hargirso's eyes were deep, dark holes. There was no hint of playfulness that you might expect from a child, no baleful beseeching from someone in such a dire circumstance. They were empty, lifeless. His father, Tesfaye, a smallholder farmer, his eyes stared blankly ahead, right past his son, into space, past me. His eyes spoke of guilt. When I interviewed Tesfaye asked me some questions. What have I done to my son, he asked. What have I done to cause this? There in those eyes of father and son, I found my true calling as a journalist. My career changed at that moment, for here was one story that I couldn't leave. After years of wandering from story to story, I knew this was one that I needed to stop and examine and keep coming back to. Hunger in the 21st century. What I saw indeed infected my soul. Their lifeless eyes enlivened mine. I saw wrongs and injustices that shamefully, as a journalist, I hadn't noticed before. Why was such hunger happening now after 2 years of bumper harvest in Ethiopia? Why was it happening again 19 years after the epic Ethiopian famine of 1984, when nearly 1 million people died, and we responded with pious pledges of never again that we heard around the world? Why was it happening still at the dawn of the 21st century, when more food was being produced than ever before? My journalistic mantra became outrage and inspire. Outrage that we had brought hunger with us into the 21st century, even though the Green Revolution was one of the great scientific and technological achievements of the 20th century. Inspire that ending hunger can indeed be the singular achievement of our age. We have the science, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the precedent. We've long known the way, but we couldn't summon the will. Led by my diseased soul, I embarked on a new journey. I eventually left the Wall Street Journal for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which was fashioning its own influential voice on ending hunger through agriculture development. It was a journey from journalist to factivist, to borrow a phrase from Bono at his recent TED Talk. Factivist, I heard that and I liked that. Journalist, we gather facts, so I can become a factivist. Not just an activist, but I'm a factivist. This moment of great disruption, though, went far beyond my personal impact. For Ethiopia 2003 was also this time of great disruption in the grander realm of international development, and particularly in the fight against hunger. And hooray for that. For what we saw then was that Tesfaye's question was misdirected. It shouldn't have been what had he done to his son, but what had we done to his son? Tesfaye had told me that just a year before, he had carried huge bags of surplus maize, corn, to that very same market area where he was now cradling his starving boy. Ethiopia tipped from feast to famine in almost a blink of an eye. It was kind of a biblical switch, plunge from feast to famine. What happened? What had caused that? Yes, there was a drought that was spreading across Ethiopia and elsewhere through East Africa. But that act of God only exacerbated the failures of man. Rich world governments the African governments themselves, the mighty development institutions, the private sector. We, a collective we, including myself as a journalist, we had all ignored smallholder farmers like Tesfaye. We neglected their need for access to the essential elements of farming that are available practically to farmers everywhere else in the world. Access to better quality seeds, soil nutrients, extension training advice, financing, insurance, risk spreading, good markets, efficient, workable markets, decent storage facilities, modern infrastructure improvements. We had all considered the smallholder farmers, particularly those in Africa, as being too poor, too remote, too insignificant to be considered worthy customers for services, to be considered worthy of our investments. We had figured, and our prevailing philosophy and practice was, in the rich world, we've got plenty of food. We have huge surpluses here and in Europe and elsewhere in the rich world. If they're hungry over there, we'll send them food. We'll feed them. The result? The yields of Africa's smallholder farmers are maybe 1/5 or 1/10 the yields of farmers in the United States and elsewhere in the world. 30% of their crops routinely go to waste before they even get off the farm because of lousy storage facilities. If they do have a surplus on those rare occasions, it's frequently followed by ruinous price declines because of inefficient markets. And those price declines undercut and sap whatever incentive the farmers have to produce crops because they're losing money. Oftentimes, out of their success comes their failure. This has given us Africa's cruelest irony. Africa's hungriest people are her smallholder farmers. People who rise every morning to grow their own food, to grow enough food to feed their families. More often than not, they fail. And during an annual hunger season, which is a period of profound deprivation that lasts and can stretch from the time when the food from their previous harvest runs out, because they've consumed it, they've sold it for other needs, to the time when a new harvest comes in. That can be a period from maybe 1 month, or it can extend to 9 or 10 months. It is a time when food is rationed, when meals shrink from 3 a day to 2 to 1 to none. It can happen for several days in a row where there's nothing more except a weak cup of tea or just a tiny bowl of porridge for the family to eat until they're able to scrounge enough money to buy enough food to maybe have 1 meal a day. Hungry farmers. Think of that phrase, hungry farmers. How absurd, how obscene, how shameful. Hungry farmers ought to be an oxymoron. It is an oxymoron. How can farmers be hungry? But the sad reality is that this oxymoron is instead of truism, and had become a truism for far too many farmers in Africa, and smallholder farmers. But in Ethiopia in 2003, we looked into those eyes of those hungry farmers and we saw what needed to be done. We saw the tragedy of hungry farmers. And we began to change. We began to shed our indifference. We began to reverse our negligence. And look what can happen. This is a photo of Zipporah Bekete with 3 of her 4 children. They're in front of their house made of mud and sticks. It leaks in the rain. Zipporah is a farmer in Western Kenya, a smallholder farmer. I met her at the beginning of 2011 when I was beginning my reporting of my book, The Last Hunger Season. Tzipporah told me that the year before, she only had enough resources, lack of financing, her poverty, she only had enough to access seeds and just even microdosing of fertilizer to plant only 1/4 acre of maize, corn, their staple crop. Even with good weather, she was only able to harvest 2 90-kilogram bags of maize. Well, that food didn't last very long. It lasted only a couple of months. Their hunger season stretched for 9 months. The family became increasingly weaker day by day. Little David, 2 years old, then 3 years old as the year went on, manifestly malnourished, distended stomach. He had a constant cough. Wherever you can always tell where David was by his cough. His 2 sisters, Cynthia and Tabitha, so thin. Their mother, Tzipporah, so weak, so tired. Look into their eyes. See the desperation. Hungry farmers. But Tzipporah had heard of the work of a new social enterprise organization that was bringing some disruptive thinking in agriculture development to their area of Western Kenya. It's an organization called the 1 Acre Fund. And they didn't see these smallholder farmers as too poor, too remote, too insignificant. It saw them as worthy customers, clients, for seeds, soil nutrients, extension advice, and the microfinancing to pay for it all. Their goal was to end the hunger season. Desperate, Tzipporah joined at the beginning of 2011. With her small loan, she was able to afford enough seeds and microdosing levels of fertilizer. There it is on the back of a motorcycle. They sit around and they transport this home for the women farmers. Enough to plant 1 acre of maize. She received planting advice and extension training. She and her husband, Sanat, every morning they were amazed and astonished by how high their maize was growing over their entire acre. They harvested a miracle. 20 bags of maize being stored in her bedroom, right next to the malaria net. A 10-fold increase. Imagine that. A 10-fold increase. It was enough to feed the family throughout the year and to begin to dream. One of the dreams, in addition to setting aside money for the kids' education, is to build a new house. There's a blueprint that she gave of the new house she planned. There's a little thing for a bathroom. Wouldn't have running water, it would have a hose come in that provide water from a cistern. But imagine that, water. Think of the sanitation, the hygiene benefits from that. There's a study room for the kids to study. She gave me this blueprint and showed it to me at the end of 2011. Now, early this year, in January 2013, I went back to visit Tzipporah and the other farmers in the book. And here's what I found. Their new house, made of solid bricks, rising up beside the old one. Little David, healthy now. He's in kindergarten. He's picking purple flowers for his mother on the way home from school. He's eating a good lunch. Sweet potatoes is what they had the day that I was there. He's got a cup of porridge, a cup of milk. David, a 2-fisted drinker. His mother, Tzipporah, now look in her eyes now. Happy, smiling, admiring her son. Look in her eyes. See the joy. See the promise of smallholder farmers. See the good news of agriculture development. A large chunk of that good news is that these smallholder farmers like Tzipporah and Tesfaye, they are now at the center, and the very center and the core of the discussion of the future of food. For if we are to meet one of the great challenges of coming decades, to nearly double food production on our planet, to meet the ever-increasing rise of population by 2050, we will need all the farmers in the world to be as productive as possible, and especially the smallholder farmers. For you see, if they succeed, so might we all in this great challenge. Think of the irony. Once neglected, now indispensable. That's very, very, very positive disruption. So let's keep it rolling. Join me in raising the clamor. Demand an end to the hunger season. Let's take everybody, let's spread the disease of the soul. Let's take everybody into the eyes of the hungry, where we will all see that in this, the 13th year of the 21st century, nobody, particularly the smallholder farmers of Africa and their children, should be dying of hunger and malnutrition. Thank you.